What's up, YouTuber? Josue Kula here. So we'll be looking at the REST API versioning. It is true that the majority of us do not version, the REST API, and it's not that a big requirement where each REST API application should be versioned. But I will look at why we should consider versioning a REST API. What are some of the consideration we need to take into account when versioning a REST API? So as you know, when the user issue a request to the server, as we can see on the screen, usually it's a request that may be having this format where the version is passed on the URL. As you can see on this instance, we have the user issuing a request on the URL /v1/services/. So the assumption in this request is that the user wanna navigate through the services to see which URL they can use, and the expectation for this user is to get sort of a response from the server that makes sense of using this REST API. But we can see the response is unexpected. All of a sudden the response is now what the user was expecting. Something like a status code is for 4404, the message not found, please use v2. So, and the payload response here can be anything unexpected from the request. The assumption on this scenario is that the user was expecting something from the v1. All of a sudden, the payload retained something unexpected, something that was out of the expectation. And this is sort of a base case that we should emphasize, if not highlight, that can motivate the REST API developer to version their endpoints. And then although there is no intrinsic value in versioning the REST API, but there are some consideration we can highlight so we can know when should we version a REST API. So when should we version a REST API? So we should version a REST API every time the URL require additional errors. Let's say for the sake of this tutorial, we have the user requesting v1/services, and previously they used to call these endpoints as a public endpoint without any authorization, without any requirements, additional error to say. But now the v1 require the authorization error to authenticate, to allow the user to authenticate. So every time we have additional error that need to be passed in each request, it's always the best option to version that particular endpoint. In this case, instead of letting the user continue using the v1, they should probably use something like a v1.1, so they can pass the authorization error on their request. We should also version our endpoints when there is a major update on response data. So by major updates, I mean, let's say, we had a version 1.0 that used to response only with make. For this instance, we're assuming the data is relating to a phone or a product object or product entity. So we have the make Samsung, we have the model S4, and all of a sudden there is a new requirement, or the response is tremendously changed that they can impact the way user consume the REST endpoints or the REST API. So every time there is, and I'm assuming here we're not just heading a two field. There may be a long, big, nested payload. So in that case, we should consider, you know, or using a different version than the previous one, because the payload has changed and the payload can affect the way user consume our endpoints. We should also version our API when there is a value added feature on services. And service here relates to the endpoint by itself, or the URL that exposes data or any services on the consumer side. So we assume here the serial feed and the valid until feed is value added data that's bring value on the side of the developer, on the side of any user that we consume these endpoints. So every time there is a value added on endpoints, we should version our REST API. And these are kind of like a typical example using serial and valid until. And the assumption here, let's say, the majority of our consumer has been using this endpoint. They didn't need a serial number. They didn't need a valid until the expiration, where Samsung we discuss, we decide to get rid of supporting this particular product. But all of a sudden, for them to continue building the application, they need this valid until information. So in this case, if they need that, if the valid until feed makes sense of bringing value in the application, we can say that the valid until and the serial number are valued added feature or value added information. They can bring something on the front end in terms of data. So every time there is value added feature on the services on the endpoint, we should consider also versioning our REST API. We should also version our REST API when there is a bug fix that affects the whole application, the whole API consumers. As you know, for those of us that have used any major REST API, whether using AWS API or Twitter API or even Shopify API, you will see sometimes there are some endpoints that. So if there is a bug fix that affects your API consumer, you should also version. We assume there is a big bug that was kind of like affecting the old consumer, and now the team decided, hey, we need to fix this bug. As soon as the bug is fixed, it's always better to release a new version relating to that API. So that's all as far as versioning, when we should version our REST API. So we'll be talking about how we can version in Django REST framework, but the same techniques are apply to different framework. So we'll be looking at different versioning schemes that are used in Django REST framework, as you know. In Django REST framework, which is an application that run under Django framework. So we have the package versioning coming from the REST framework, and within the package versioning, we got different classes which represent different schemes used to version application. So for this tutorial, we'll be talking about the namespace versioning, and when every time we see the concept namespace, we think of a set of objects or elements that are grouped under a uniquely identified name. So the namespace versioning scheme apply when you version your REST endpoint or your URL in the REST API using the concept of URL namespace and the concept of URL namespace in Django REST framework. We'll be looking about that. We'll be looking practically what is the difference between the instance namespace that can be applied to the URL and the application namespace, so we can map those namespace on the URL onto the URL pattern configuration. Okay, let's quickly go at as you can see here, we have the namespace. We pass the instance namespace on the URL configuration. So the v1 is the namespace that identify this URL as a unique URL in the URL configuration package. When Django run, it first run all the configuration, the URL configuration, and within the URL configuration we can have the URL names, we can have the URL namespace. So the namespace versioning is the ability to namespace your URL. So for instance, in this case, we may have the v2 product with namespace v2, which can identify that particular URL in the way that can be unique. Demo. So let's look at the demo and see how we can apply the namespace versioning on our URL.